happening within the country. Very good morning, Dr. Ssemogerere, and welcome to Morning at NTV.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, viewers.
Glad, and you're most welcome. I would like to simply understand your bird eyes view of Uganda right now before we even begin to tackle the nitty-gritty of where we are in light of the demise of Paul Ssemogerere and where the crisis in the east of Democratic Republic of Congo leaves us. When you look at Uganda right now as a political analyst, where are we?
It's a very tough question. I don't think there is a very specific answer I can put on the table. But I think the biggest challenge as we speak is how Uganda will be able to move from the presidency of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni to the next presidency.
That's our biggest challenge. It's
our biggest challenge today. All the others are secondary. Because you see, in many countries on the African continent, where they've had presidents that have governed for a very long time, the moment the transition is not, the moment they fail to manage the transition, the consequences have been disastrous. That's what we have seen in Libya. That's what we have seen in Ivory Coast and in many countries. So I think as a country, that's the biggest challenge for now. Okay. The earlier that debate started, the better. I remember in the previous parliament, Dr. Lulu Mebaiga, the former Wikwe South Member of Parliament, of course he missed in the previous parliament, but in the current parliament he returned. He had introduced a bill to that effect. It died along the way because the parliament, the subsequent parliament did not come back. This, he returned. It's 1 year into the term of this parliament. I haven't heard anything serious in regards to that in parliament. But I think that would be our biggest preoccupation as a country, managing how we are going to be able to move from one regime to another, because it's one of the biggest tests for any country. Tanzania has been able to manage it successfully. Kenya has done so. So I think Uganda should also be able to have a clear framework of managing it. As we speak, there is no clarity on how that can be managed, which is a huge challenge. I mean, you can advance economically, you can have the peace and stability you want to talk about, but if you do not solve that puzzle, you can slide back more than 100 years. And the evidence is clear on the African continent. If you look at Libya, if you look at Somalia, I mean, I don't think in our lifetime we will be able to see a stable Somalia, a stable Libya.
Okay. And just to follow up with that, Dr. Kaziwe, when you say we will need a framework, what would work as a framework to aid that kind of transition? Because if we had to reflect back on how this very same regime came into power, it had to take a stretch of about 10 years for us to then get back democratic rights, elective rights, to then be able to enjoy what we have today. So what kind of roadmap would then aid that kind of transition for the next Ugandan regime?
I think we need an honest discussion. And I believe the people to start that honest discussion should be the people in government. Countries that have managed and passed that test like Kenya have done so. Moi was a very, very powerful guy in Kenya. But he got to a point and realized that Kenya was bigger than him and that was an ordinary mortal, like every one of us, that at one point in time was going to leave. So he started a discussion on a transition, amending the constitution, and it's that constitution that heralded a new political dispensation in 2003. And Kenya has never been the same again. So I think that's the discussion we've got to have here. But even in Kenya, it wasn't easy. Within KANU, the ruling party at the time, there were extremists who did not want to hear anything to do with preparation for a transition. There were very many. But Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi decided to be a visionary leader by leading at that front.
Oh, by accepting some of the conditions, of course, that he set himself, and the fact that the parties that were within that discussion agreed to guarantee his safety, and the fact that some of the what can I describe them as? For example, not being pursued on perceived crimes.
Of course, and many Kenyan politicians have written about this in their autobiographies. For example, when NAC got power in 2003, still within Chipachi's government, you had extremists who wanted, people have written about this.
Let's be frank and honest about this. Do you think President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni needs to be given the guarantee of safety for anything? I do not know. I can't, for example, put a finger to specific crimes or aspects that he might be uncomfortable to face justice later. Does he need that guarantee right now?
And just to top up on Chris's question, who is going to give him the guarantee?
Yeah, who is going to give him the guarantee?
Let me tell you, and I will use the Kenyan example. A discussion of that nature is never a simple discussion between an antagonist and a protagonist.
Sure.
You have stakeholders at a regional and at an international level. So in that framework, you have people who have leverage over the actors on either side. And they will be able to prevail on them, because some of the agreements are going to be written and result into decisions that are legal, but others are going to be gentleman's agreements. So how are you going to implement gentleman's agreements? That's why I'm telling you that after all those discussions and agreements, Moi accepting to hand over power peacefully to Chibachi. You had people within NAC who wanted to witch hunt Moi. But then, because there were people who had leverage over Mwai Kibaki was able, Mwai Kibaki was able to prevail over the extremists within the NAC government.
Okay. We find ourselves saying our goodbyes to one of the veteran politicians in the country who was buried yesterday, Paul Kanga Ssemogerere. And there was a discussion yesterday as we hosted some of the eminent politicians in Uganda to find their views on what his legacy was. A creation of an council of elders in the country. That has been done before, where we saw Ogola and the like. Do you think eminent politicians right now, especially the older ones, must be brought together and given the mandate to be able to speak to and at some of the politicians of the day?
That's not necessarily the view I take, though I have no issue with it.
Okay.
For me, what's important in regards to the life and legacy of the late Dr. Paul Kawanga Ssemogerere, my important thing is, the most important thing for me is for politicians to be able to learn from his political life. For me, I think it's the most important thing. I'm one of those people who believe that when somebody retires, he should be left to retire. And that's what Dr. Kawanga Ssemogerere did. When he handed over power to John Sebanachis in 2005, you never saw him competing for space. So when he retired to his Rubaga home, he was only available for consultation. Not to take decisions. Not to make decisions for the party.
That's right.
I mean, he remained influential, but you never saw him competing for space. When Norbert Mao succeeded John Sabana Kizito,
yeah.
you had many voices against him within the DP. And of late, when he chose to join the NRM, you had many people within...
To work with the NRM.
Okay, to work with the NRM. To work with the NRM. Yeah. There are many people within the Democratic Party who are still opposed to that decision. And I suspect Paulo Kawanga Ssemogerere must have been among those. But you never saw him addressing a press conference
on the issue,
rebuking Nobati Mao. Why? But he kept advising the young Turks like Dr. Lulu Mebaiga and the likes, who took on Nobati Mao with his decision to work with the NRM. So I think it's a smarter strategy for people who have retired, because sometimes when you choose not to leave the stage, even the good things you did might be washed away. And I think it is very important that you take a back seat and be available for consultation. Let the people who have come after you make their own mistakes. But it's not criminal for people who have come after you to come to you to seek guidance. And that's what politicians have been doing. Yeah. When it comes to the late Kawanga Ssemogerere, I mean, his home has been a home for politicians, especially opposition politicians across the board. He was that type of politician. I think it's important for all of us to learn that from Paul Kawanga Ssemogerere. Then, again from Kawanga Ssemogerere, from his political life, we learn the beauty of simplicity, the beauty of modesty. He was not among those politicians who joined the politics to make money. He joined the politics to create a difference. And history speaks for itself. I mean, just look at his home. He occupied very key positions in this government. If he had wanted to become stinkingly rich, he would have died a very rich man. But he chose not to. In fact,
one testifies of him having had a trip out of the country, but that trip did not actually mature to what it was intended to do. And when, upon return, he came back and actually took the money back to the treasury.
And it was not on one occasion.
Transparency and openness to duty above self has definitely shaped a lot of Uganda's politics and politicians of that time. But also, relatedly, still referring to working with present governments. He's one who had gone through the ballot paper twice, and he chose to work with the NRM government. And he, again, as you've alluded, he went through up to one of the highest ranks of leadership in governance. But the fact that he worked, I want you to help us understand, is there any crime in opposition parties working alongside present governments in order to build a consolidated future for a nation?
You see, Ssemogerere's working relationship with the NRM government was totally different from the working relationship you have between Mao and the NRM. When the NRA/NRM captured power in 1986, it claimed that theirs was going to be a broad-based government, some sort of transitional government to herald a new political dispensation. That was the clear condition. So Kawanga Ssemogerere and others joined on that condition, which is okay. And it was in the open. It was in the open.
That's right.
Now, when Kawanga Ssemogerere realized that he had been shortchanged, he chose to walk away. He was at the time a deputy prime minister and a cabinet minister. But he chose to walk away. There are not so many politicians who would do so, because you want to enjoy that comfort of enjoying the taxpayers' money, to be, I mean, driven with in those fuel guzzlers and all those small things that come with the big offices. He was not the type to be excited by those very small things. So he chose to walk away in a principle. So it's different. I mean, a working arrangement of different political parties based on principle is okay. That's why I said that a transition is important for this country. That if you're going to have a discussion of that type, that is in the open, all these issues can be brought to the fore. But if discussions are going to be secretive, then the end result is also going to be disastrous, and it's not going to be helpful for this country. So I see no wrong in what Ssemogerere did in 1986 to join a broad-based government, because he was not alone. Many other political actors joined based on a principle. The moment he realized that the NRM government at the time was not going to implement what they had agreed upon, he walked away. So I see no harm in that.
Okay. Still relatedly, in regards to his passing, we all know that the graveyard tends to be one of the richest and wealthiest places on earth. This man, with all his pedigree, he has gone down in history as a good leader, but I feel like he has gone with him what would have constituted good politics and governance and democracy integrations that he would have dispersed to the next generation that would then aid the environment of having the transition dialogue that you are referring to. How do we then get to harness some of these abilities and skills to pass them on to the next generation that will hold this nation?
I think
for those that are still surviving of good conduct.
I think on the downside, when it comes to Dr. Ssemogerere, his greatest undoing on my part to our generation is his failure to produce an autobiography while he's still alive.
Okay.
Yeah.
For me.
At least we do not know of
absolutely.
that.
And you see, he has been
we are hoping
a
something
key
can come up.
participant in Uganda's politics for the last 60 years, because prior to our independence, he was the secretary, some kind of chief of staff to Benedict Chiwanuka, our first chief minister. You can even call him our first prime minister. So he has been part and parcel of the border politics of Uganda. Through and through. Now, denying us an opportunity to see things from his perspective. I mean, we would have the liberty to disagree, but it would be important. Yeah, it would be important to be able to. For us to see things from his perspective. Unfortunately, because he had all the time to do that. He retired from active politics in 1996. So he had all the time to do that. So it means he deliberately chose not to, because, of course, of several reasons. Sometimes people don't want to write autobiographies because they think if they are going to be brutally honest, there are other people they are going to hurt, yet those people are still alive. Some of them still have careers to build. But I would want to advise many other politicians who are still alive, and politicians who should write autobiographies for us and the next generation, that people in the advanced world, what they do once faced with that dilemma, you can have an initial autobiography and exclude things that you're uncomfortable with. With the time, you keep improving it with versions. I can tell you Obama, as of today, has 3 autobiographies. The first one was Dreams from My Father. The second, The Audacity of Hope. The third, A Promised Land. So in all those books, you're going to find elements that do not exist in the other. So in The Promised Land, because he writes it after achieving or assuming the most powerful seat on planet Earth, there is no any other aspiration.
So becoming God self.
Okay. So he's now at liberty to say whatever he wants without being politically correct. True. Things that he wouldn't have said in Dreams from My Father when he was looking up to some serious stuff ahead of him, things he wouldn't say in the Odesto of Hope, because actually even that book called Odesto of Hope almost cost him his presidency, because in the Odesto of Hope, he introduces a pastor who turns out to be very radical and extreme. So in the heat of the campaign, his opponents dig out the dirty secrets of his former pastor, because actually the title Odesto of Hope comes from a sermon delivered by that pastor. So you see how this autobiography was going to cost Obama
his presidency.
His presidency.
That's something that he went
So
on to address.
I understand that many politicians, because I've talked to several here over the years in my career as a journalist, some are not comfortable writing their autobiographies because they say, if I'm to write, I've got to be honest. But if I'm going to be honest, I might end up hurting others, even myself.
But then again, they can write and preserve it for such a time as when
that's the point I was making.
On, and then it can be brought to light.
That's the point I was making. Because now what happens is, the family told us at the funeral that they are now going to patch up material here and there and come up with a book. But that, at the end of the day, the weight of that
is not
autobiography depreciates the moment it is published after the passing of the person you're writing about.
But most importantly, because it's published by another person.
Absolutely.
You know? All right, interesting there. Of course,
no, it doesn't matter if it's published by another person. Let me give you an example.
Or written, rather.
It's okay even then. I mean, most of these autobiographies are written by other people. Daniel Kalinachi wrote the autobiography of Kizza Besigye, but from his perspective and with his interviews. And Besigye said, I agree largely with what exists in that book. So it's a perfect, autobiography, because it is written when Besigye is still alive, and he's not saying that the things that appear in that book are not true.
Good.
So it doesn't matter, because most of these people don't have the skills to write. It's a skill. You can always hire somebody to write for you. But the most important thing is for an autobiography to be published during your time.
Allow me ask what I believe is a question that many Ugandans wouldn't want to bring themselves up to. Paul Kawanga Ssemogerere represented moderate politics. The politics that is not extreme or aggressive. Of recent, we've seen people like retired Major General Gregory Mugisha Muntu espouse a certain brand of politics that is arguably alien to Uganda's settings. We do not understand any other politics that doesn't seek to dislodge, that doesn't seek to do away with a system, the kind of communication of the language and the use of the need to bring about changes. And perhaps it's one of the undoings on his part, but again for us as a country. Are we at a point where we need to figure out what kind of politicians must take us forward? Are they the ones that are slightly extreme? Do the moderate ones not do the job for us? How best should a politician who is aspiring right now come and approach politics in Uganda to be effective in being an agent or a catalyst for transformation?
You see, in politics and in any kind of activism, both models are important because they complement each other. All successful movements and revolutions across the globe have had those people. Whether you're talking about the construction of the United States as we know it today, you had all those models. You had people who were moderates, but you also had those that are extreme.
The hardliners.
But the ability to learn that the two can work hand in hand is the most important thing. Even when we go to, you go back to the ANC struggle in South Africa, I mean, you had those two camps. And it's okay to have a healthy competition of those two brands. Because they complement each other. I will give you an example. In the United States in the 1960s, the two leading civil rights activists were Martin Luther King Jr. and Alhaji Malik Ali Shabazz. popularly known as Malcolm X.
X.
Martin was a little moderate, was moderated, probably because of his background.
Very level-headed.
Malcolm X was extreme, certainly because of his background. Certainly because of his background. Because the system treated him in a very demeaning way. That's why he even dropped out of school in grade 6. He says in his autobiography that one time a teacher came walking in class asking each student what they wanted to be in future. So Malcolm told him that I want to be a lawyer. He said, Malcolm, can't you get serious for once? You want to joke all the time. Niggers can only be artisans. Can only be
Rappers.
So Malcolm was like, am I in the right place? Because even the guys that are last in this class have told him they want to be lawyers, they want to be doctors, and he's just encouraging him. For me, the best student in this class, I can't be what I want to be. So he dropped out of school. He went on the streets. He became a highway robber, a drug dealer, jailed for years, walked out of prison, a reformed man, and he led a movement against the white supremacy in the United States. So you can see his background. But Martin Luther King's background, his dad was a Baptist minister. He had a modest education. In fact, by the age of 30, he was a PhD holder in theology. So his treatment was not similar to the treatment of Malcolm X. So it partly explains why one was extreme and the other moderate. But they complemented each other. So one time, Malcolm X visited Georgia, the home state of Martin Luther King, and launched a scathing attack on him as an Uncle Tom. The house Negro. So Martin Luther was so offended that despite the difference in our ideologies, but our aspiration is the same.
The same.
Why did this man do this? So Malcolm told him, I'm not going to meet you. Send me your wife. I will explain to her why I did that to you. So Martin sent the wife, the late Coretta King, to meet Malcolm. And Malcolm told her, do you know what? What I did was the best endorsement to your husband in his movement. You know why? Because there were some whites who were still doubting him. Because for me, I don't work. I mean, Malcolm never believed in working with whites. But Malcolm was working, Martin was working with some whites, but there were also other whites who were not willing to work with him.
That's right.
So Malcolm told King, his wife, that the purpose of my journey to Georgia was to tell those whites that you better work with Martin, because if you don't, you're likely to see the worst in me. So better hurry up to work with him. So when Coretta King delivered the news and the information to Martin Luther King, he was so surprised, pleasantly surprised, because he didn't know that in a way Malcolm's activities were complementing
his own
activities. So there is a point I want to conclude with here. So the two can complement each other. But now, the unfortunate bit in countries like Uganda, where people have struggled for long, they want to see change, it's not coming, there is a tendency to dismiss all moderates as less important and as people who have derailed the move to cause change. That's the unfortunate bit. In fact, Kawanga Ssemogerere, General Mugisha Muntu, Benichwan and others fall in the category of people in politics who live before their times. You see, in politics, there are three categories of categories of leaders. One, you have leaders who live during their time, those who live before their time, and those that live after their time.
After their time.
The best leader is one who lives in his time. So the challenge with people like Kawanga Ssemogerere is to live before their time. Because the values he stands for, the values Kawanga Ssemogerere stands for, truthfulness, honest, are much cherished values.
Yes.
But a society and an environment that doesn't appreciate such, looks at such attributes as disadvantages, as weaknesses. In fact, that's why he has not had the opportunity to govern this country, despite those attributes. But I'm damn sure that many years to come, historians will judge him as the best president Uganda never had.
All right, transitioning from the best president Uganda has never had, getting into the East African region, there's war left, right and center. We do have DRC right now that is, of course, facing so many insurgencies left, right and center. 20 years down the road from what happened in Goma, it's still, it recovers, resettles, and it goes back to ground zero for that matter. Over the years, in the 90s, we did actively participate as a country in the one DRC, for which it has come down to cost Uganda some millions of dollars that we have to pay to the DRC in that regard. And yet you see in present time, between the two presidents, they're trying to amalgamate, they're trying to bridge the relationship between Uganda and DRC amidst what's happening with the M23 rebels right now. So just between DRC and Uganda, and given that kind of sour, bitter relationship in the past, do we see the two countries merging to move forward in a peaceful manner regarding this conversation?
Just a moment, Priscilla, before the good doctor gives us the perspective of that particular issue and the crisis in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo and how Uganda finds itself in a mix. Let's take a break. When we return, Dr. Sam Kaziwe shall be, of course, taking on that question as brought forward by Priscilla. Do stay with us. You're watching Morning at NTV. This is the Kickstarter.
NTV.
A very good morning and welcome back to our Kickstarter discussion, where we are, of course, looking at the situation on ground in terms of the political landscape in the country and, of course, what it means and where exactly we ought to be as a nation. Of course, perspective and analysis is coming in from Dr. Sam Kaziwe. Before we went for the break, he was taking on a question that had been asked by my colleague, Priscilla Regina Naloga. Allow me transition to that submission right away. Dr. Sam Kaziwe, Priscilla had asked the question.
Yes, his question wanted an answer relating to the conflict between Uganda and Congo.
Yes.
But you see, the moment you focus your energies on Rwanda and DRC Congo, you end up missing the point. Because the conflict in Congo is much bigger than Uganda and Rwanda.
Yeah.
It's regional and it's international. You know those shapes. So, if you want to find a lasting solution to this conflict, you need to have all the international players that have leverage over the actors in this conflict in that discussion. For example, how do you give orders to Congo without talking to Angola? Because certainly, the moment you intervene and Angola sees that the establishment in Kinshasa is threatened, it will come on board. You don't have to invite it.
You don't have to invite.
You don't have to
And
invite
we have seen it coming on board.
Yes. So, how do you speak to DRC and agree with the DRC when South Africa is out of the equation? How do you speak to Rwanda and you think that it's going to play by the ball when UK is not part of the equation? So this conflict is much bigger than Uganda and Rwanda. It needs an international framework to address it. And in that international framework, you would have people who have leverage over the actors. And the solution, by the way, is political. So the moment you think you're going to use the gun to settle the conflict, you're daydreaming. Of course, the Kenyan troops are there. But there is little that they are going to do. There is little that they are going to do. The conflict in Congo is a political conflict. It's an economic conflict.
Interesting. Allow me just delve a little bit on the issue of the complexity of this particular conflict and the fact that you allude to South Africa, Angola, and the UK being part of it. Of course, somebody out there would also say Belgium has to come on board, because at the end of the day, King Leopold and the shadow or the specter of colonialism,
but their influence has gradually reduced.
Yeah. It's recently.
I can tell you,
King Felipe was there.
Yeah, that was just a visit. The last time M23 was flushed out of Congo, you had the Tanzanian troops and the South African troops throwing them out.
Okay, so right now, there are concerns or people who say the East African community doesn't hold the key to the solutions and that SADC actually does. Could you bring in the perspectives for us to understand how South Africa comes into play and being a very critical actor, especially with regard to getting a solution?
Because of the existence of minerals in Congo,
yes,
South Africa, as an African superpower, must have an interest there. I mean, many Ugandans, if you were to tell them today that I want to take you to a tour in Congo, fully sponsored, many would opt out. But if you're in South Africa, one time I was at Oliver Tambo Airport, and I had a boarding call for people going to Kivu. And I was like,
North Kivu.
Who is going to Kivu here? Then I saw well-dressed white gentlemen in their three-piece suits walking to the gates. So as you people fear to go there, there are investors in South Africa who are interested
in what's the minerals.
The minerals in Congo. So there are economic interests for them. There are economic interests for them. So that's why you see, because of their working relationship with the Congo, South Africa becomes an enemy of Rwanda. Becomes an enemy of Rwanda. As we speak, it's very difficult for a citizen of Rwanda to get a visa to South Africa if you didn't know. Very, very extremely difficult. In fact, when I was a student in South Africa pursuing my PhD, we had a colleague from Rwanda who was pursuing a master's in nursing. So she overstayed her study permit and she wanted it to be renewed. Of course, these graduate studies can extend beyond your expectations and beyond your control. So she wanted an extension. It took a full year for the South African government to evaluate the application of this student to be allowed to come back to complete her degree.
A student in their country. Okay.
Because you know what has happened to Rwandan exiles in South Africa. So the South African government also chose to crack the whip.
So there is they have silent animosity.
They are sworn enemies as we speak, Rwanda and South Africa. But what's the origin? Congo. So in this conflict, you need to have all these players if you want to get to the bottom of the problem and establish where the problem lies and find solutions. But in finding those solutions, you also have people or states that have leverage over those that are going to destabilize the region.
Let me ask, what then are the interests of, for example, our neighbors Kenya in the peace talks that they're enabling right now in regards to this conversation, but also the peace talks that they seem to be relatedly engaging in with the Tigray people?
two different things.
I know. Yeah, but the common thing there is Kenya. Yeah.
Kenyan interest in Congo. First, it's an economic interest. An economic interest.
Yeah.
I mean, you see, for us, we've participated in many wars in Congo, worked with the Congolese government. But what do we sell there? You have small traders and SMEs operating there. Kenya has got big-time investments in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's an area of interest. You have their banks already there. The other time during the campaign, William Ruto was telling people at a campaign rally that I'm going to get you market for your milk in Congo. I mean, they have 80 million people, but they are not able, because of the conflicts, to produce enough food for themselves. So it was like, because the people of central Kenya are good at dairy farming. Yeah. So he promised to get them a market in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the first area of interest is economics. Two, Kenya wants to be a regional player and a regional influencer in this entire eastern horn of Africa, not only the political East Africa, but the entire greater horn of Africa. It wants to be a regional player. And being the biggest economy, you can't blame them for trying to do so. Yeah. So basically, that's the reason as to why you're seeing them at the forefront. But at the same time, they can also be neutral in this conflict because they share no border with Democratic Republic of Congo. Usually in peace operations at the international, peace enforcement operations at the international level, it becomes problematic to introduce troops from a country that shares a border with the country where you want to enforce peace because of other underlying factors as a result of those shared borders, sibling
and that's something that has already played out with the M23.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So it is in a much better place to lead these negotiations, but it can't succeed alone. We need more powerful players to join Kenya in trying to solve this crisis.
Interesting perspective you offer there, something that opens my eyes to something that perhaps we should have had a conversation on as early as 10 years ago. When Uganda seeks to go into the Democratic Republic of Congo, there are economic interests, of course, but largely for personal benefit. So much so that a dealer or two in timber, copper, uranium, titanium, and some of these minerals sees an incursion or an expansion in there as one that is for himself and the small cattle, and not the country, Uganda. Do you think if Uganda was to adopt a new model of dealing with the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we pursue interests just like Kenya seems to be pursuing? I don't want to say William Ruto is hell-bent on taking business persons. It's something that I need to get facts on before I can readily say that is exactly what he's doing. Do you think Uganda must also do that, so that we are clear enough to know that if we are to go to the Congo and take the UPDF to the Congo, Uganda as a country benefits in terms of money coming to the national coffers, and not necessarily, like accusations have gone on, benefiting a few?
Yeah, I think the government for many years in this conflict has done a disservice to itself by not being open when it comes to operations of this nature. Our counterparts in Kenya, Tanzania, are always, leave alone being strategic, but they are open about these discussions. So that's why on many occasions even find many Ugandans on the streets, if you did vox pops, may not be in support of their government if it goes for a peace operation anywhere, because, and you can't blame them because they do not even know why they are there. In peace missions like this, before a country goes there, it is important that you set clear objectives. As we speak, Ugandans have never known the clear objectives of our engagement in Congo in the last 20 years. Never. The clear objectives. 2, after setting out the objectives, you've got to articulate them so that the population understands them. But these are things that are never even discussed in Parliament. But what we say are so secretive, our neighbors discuss them. Our neighbors discuss them, and at the end of the day, people get to know what's happening. So the government has not helped itself to, first of all, even get the public support for these operations. But also, when the discussions are open, you get more views that help you to enrich your objectives. And at the end of the day, the entire state ends up benefiting. Unfortunately, the moment discussions are secretive, the objectives are secretive, different officers within government will say different reasons as to why we are there. So it creates a problem, and that's the problem we've had as a country when it comes to Congo for many years.
You allude to the fact that different government officials issue different communication with regard to why and whether we are even in Congo for whatever particular reason that is. I would like to focus on the aspect of self-determination for the people who the M23 claims to be fighting for, something that puts the M23 more in a position where it is under the canopy of, allegedly, Kampala, something that government more than 7 years ago was very open about, the fact that they were giving them a refuge and they were talking to the rebel leaders. Right now, Kinshasa says Kampala's explicit support to the M23 is a bone of contention in relations, and they are willing to sever diplomatic relations, including blocking the Uganda Airlines, our very precious birds, from going to Kinshasa. That is where we are right now. Do you think self-determination on the part of people of Rwandan descent who are in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo causes Uganda to have a critical interest, especially when it comes to their well-being?
I think if you're objective, you must admit that the government in Kinshasa has not treated these people nicely.
Ah, okay.
Of course, it's true that majority of them are descendants of migrants. But once people are born in a certain territory,
geographical area,
you cannot tell them that you are now foreigners. So DRC must also appreciate, because I doubt that the M23 have the capacity to overthrow, as of now, the government in Kinshasa.
No.
The best they can is to create a regional enclave.
Yeah.
And Congo has
From
been governed that way for many years. You have more than 100 militias, besides M23, in Congo. But they also have a valid point that they have been mistreated. You heard the other day what happened in Parliament. The Speaker rebuking a member of Parliament of Rwandan descent in Parliament, that why don't you go back to your country? So the Congolese government has also got to address this political problem of theirs. They've got to appreciate it. I mean, it would be similar to Kenya saying that all Somalis in Garissa, Wajir, and Mandera go back to Somalia. It can't happen. It can't happen. So these people are not going to leave Congo. But how do you make them a little comfortable within the Democratic Republic of Congo? Because if you make them uncomfortable, you lay fertile ground for foreign interests to intervene. Because foreigners can only intervene if there are people willing to work with them. But if you do not give them the opportunity, how are they going to work with them? So I think Congo has also got to address its political problems, not to always shift blame, not to always shift blame.
Okay.
All of this comes down to, I've had Kenya, I've had Rwanda, I've had Uganda, I've had Tanzania. Where's the rest of East Africa in this conversation, especially in alluding to the fact that most recently we accepted this country to become a part of the East African Community Bloc. Now, I'm pretty sure there was good reasons for that happening. However, upon getting into the bloc, those good reasons seem to have been put to bed.
When you talk about Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, with all due respect, East Africa would be covered. Would be covered, certainly. In every regional grouping, there are countries that set the pace. That's why even in the UN, you have 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Each has got veto powers. So between me and you, you know that Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania and Kenya, that's East Africa proper. I mean, what do you expect South Sudan? What do you expect South Sudan to do? I mean, the problems they have are too many. You don't even know when they are going to settle them. Burundi, of course, they had their troops in Congo when we joined. This last time, even the Burundi troops were there. But back to your question, East Africa as a bloc has serious challenges beyond just this conflict. So unless the leaders of the countries that make up this bloc agree that they want the East African community to be effective, it will remain less important in issues affecting citizens of this community. Because what happens is these people go sit at the summit, agree on certain things. When they go back to their respective countries, they refuse to implement. They invoke the sovereignty argument.
Arguments, yeah.
That's what has happened. I mean, that's why when you go to Kenya, Tanzania, they'll still ask you for a work permit. But why? According to the treaty.
Does that mean we are getting ahead of ourselves in pursuing aspirations that we ought to perhaps extend to a decade or 2 from now? Absolutely.
We should let the EAC be organic. SADC grew in an organic manner. The same thing happened to ECOWAS. The same thing happened to the EU. But here in East Africa, sometimes when our leaders get overexcited, they also excite the population.
Yeah, like a leader who excited us that in 2024 we're going to be having one currency. I'm like,
which is impossible. Which is impossible. I mean, if we have failed to manage the simplest of things, issues to do with work permit, why should I be asked for a visa when I'm visiting one of these countries in this region? I mean,
of course, those are some of the complexities on the African continent. Allow me now transition from the East African community and the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo to something that is happening across West Africa. It is unnerving, and some politicians, especially those that have monitored and overseen some of the developments on the continent, are wondering whether we as a continent are sliding back into the colonial, the immediate post-colonial era, where the military had a very pivotal role to play in transitions of governments. Earlier we alluded to the fact that our own transition is important, and how peaceful it can be is something that has to be discussed extensively. In West Africa, coups tend to be a very convenient vehicle for a transition of government, to the extent that even if it is just months, one department or a group of soldiers can effectively effect a change of government, and then the nation goes on as though that is the established mode of transition. We've seen that happening. Just take us through coups and the role of the military in our administration, especially of state within Africa. It seems that we cannot dislodge that away from ourselves, and perhaps we must find a way of accepting that the soldiers have a very huge role to play in how we govern ourselves.
Okay. In many of those countries in West Africa and Central Africa where we've had coups of late, the reason is also partly in the failure to manage a transition when you've had a leader who has governed for long.
Okay.
Look at Burkina Faso and Blaise Compaoré for over 2 decades. It never occurred to him that was an ordinary mortal like everyone else. So when push came to shove, he was forced out. Since then, Burkina Faso has never settled, because in the attempt to create a personal monarchy of sorts in Burkina Faso, he destroyed all institutions. So even the institution of the army was destroyed,
making it susceptible to mutineering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the results are what we are seeing today. We do not even know how they are going to overcome these challenges, because it seems to be now a tip of the iceberg. The same thing happens to Mali. Of course, the many years of Major Moussa Traoré, of course, after capturing power, he promoted himself to general. The many years, of course, his regime was ended by mass protests, and one of his soldiers, of course, led a coup in 1991. In 1992, he organized an election where he did not stand. He went back to the barracks. 10 years later, he comes back, asks to be elected, was elected, he served his first term. Towards the end of his second term, he's again toppled. But you must know that Amadou Toumani Traoré, the man who was toppled around 2012, was trying to reorganize a country that had been disorganized by the dictatorship of Moussa Traoré. And he never succeeded. Towards the end of his second term, a captain, Amadou Sanogo, chose to topple him. The reason he gave was that you have failed to provide us with the necessary equipment to fight. But days after he captured, captured power, the rebels in the north were able to gain more ground. In fact, half of the country, they even created a state called Azawad Republic. Of course, later on, he was forced by ECOWAS to hand over power. So they are still suffering because of the failure to manage transition. The same thing happens in Chad with the death of General Idris Deby, temporarily succeeded by his son in the interim. But you know, you've had, he was a major general at the time, you've had protests over and over again because he had promised that was going to govern for a short period of time and then organize the elections. That has been extended. What happens today, it's quite clear that he's not going to do that. So it is the failure by leaders who think that they are successful, that they are omnipresent, the failure of those leaders to think about life in those countries after them. All right. It goes back to the question that you and I had earlier on in our press review. Is the office bigger than the person, or is the person bigger than the office? Now we'll leave you to ponder upon that as we take a break and return with further discussions. Do stay with us.
You're watching Morning at NTV.
Global Paints now comes in a new look and the most brilliant colors. Global Paints, a reliable product.
The biggest celebration of Ugandan music is here. Tugende Muchika Day at Kampala Serena Hotel on Saturday, 3rd December 2022. Standard tickets go for 100K, gold 300K, and 3 million for platinum. Featuring Eddie Away, Chance Nalubega, Sweet Kid, Kabuye Semboga, Akiki Romeo, Betty Pologoma, Ziggy D, Lady Mariam, Tina Tine, Abdumulasi, and featuring Aveka Band 0785 961 910. Dress code retro style. Sponsored by Elderly Network Foundation. Foundation, Coca-Cola, Al Breweries Limited, Kadanke, and MTN.
On the next episode is brought to you by
Rock Boom. Feel the positive energy.
On the next episode.
What are you doing here by yourself? Why didn't you knock? I have a key. I'll tell my mom that you're here. Thank you. Come on. Question. You work at the office with my dad, don't you? Yes. So then you know they have problems.
Yes, but the truth is I don't know if your mom wants to talk to me.
I just took a rock boom and I know it won't flop.
Rock Boom. Feel the positive energy.
You're watching Morning at NTV.
You're still with us at the Kickstarter discussion, where we are looking at the current state of affairs in the country and, of course, across the continent. We are going to give it a little bit of a blend by looking at how events on the international stage do affect us here, especially the war in Ukraine, and that was occasioned by Russia, and how that has played into the diplomatic end game and as far as geopolitics is concerned. But before we went for the break, we were understanding how coups across the continent that are making a resurgence as a way of transitioning from one government to the other could, of course, herald, well, a very disastrous end for many of the countries. How and what must the military do in a country, especially in this day and age? Dr. Ssemogerere, of course, is our analyst this morning and giving us all the perspective and insight that we need to be able to understand this. The discussion had ended on the Chad question and the fact that the president there, who is the son of the former president, had alluded to conditioning a transition, an election, something that he's yet to do. It is a typical promise that is given by the military or military men that we need time to prepare so that we can return to the democracy that is much needed. But it continues to show that the military is unable or willing to relinquish power. And that, of course, is something that puts many of our countries, especially within sub-Saharan Africa, at a disadvantage. In Uganda here, the military is in parliament, and it plays a very big role in our own development agenda, so much so that even the standard gauge railway, we are still waiting on the National Enterprise Corporation that is within the influence of the Uganda People's Defense Forces. Just give us perspective on where the military should be and should not be. Do we even need to discuss it, or inevitably we must?
I think in countries where we have seen the army intervening, it is usually a clear sign of failed politics.
Say that again?
Nature abhors virtue. So when politicians excuse me, fail in their roles, the army often intervenes, and that's what we have seen in the countries we have mentioned, even in Uganda in the past. It has always been a result of the failure by politicians to manage politics. So what I think is important for Uganda is to have, again, the honest discussion I have talked about. In that honest discussion, the army would know its right place. Not that it's not important, it's very, very important, critical. The army is very important for any nation state, because how do you manage the functions of the state without the army? It's impossible. But it ought to know the clear confines of engagement. I mean, armies world over assist governments in many things. If you're in the United States and there is a tsunami, you'll see the army swinging in action.
That's right.
But it knows the rules of engagement. The rules are clear. The army cannot go to the state of Louisiana because there is Katrina in 2005 and give themselves the powers of the governor. They cannot.
They can't.
They cannot. So the army is important, but discussions on its engagement are very important. For example, first of all, I do not believe that we still need Army MPs in Parliament. They were important between 86 and 95. Or, if you want, you may say up to 2006 when we opened
the space for,
political parties.
Yeah.
So you see, Army legislators in Parliament in a very complicated situation. Very complicated situation. That's what happened in 2005 during the constitutional amendments. One officer chose to abstain. And the consequences are clear for every one of us here. I mean, but he chose to abstain as dictated by the laws that army officers are supposed to be neutral. But the one who chose to be neutral suffered the consequences. So the rules ought to be clear to shield the army officers from the vagaries of politics. Very, very important. Then, even the rules, the laws have got to be amended. I mean, you have laws where individuals are part and parcel of those laws. Now, anybody who has gone to law school in the very first year, they are told that a law should not have eyes. And a law should never focus on an individual. Even if I have an issue with her, the law should not be about her.
And here we are amending laws.
But we have laws basing on individuals. We have laws whether individuals' names are implanted in there. So you cannot talk about transformation of this nation without reworking all those contradictions. That's what I can say.
Speaking of contradictions, Chris mentioned the word son, and it suddenly hit my mind that perhaps in Africa we are practicing monarchy versus democracy in transition of power. The states that you have talked about here have all had in one way or the other a father-son building of and carrying forward of transition, you know, setting their children, their sons up to become generals in the army and therefore preparing them for transition of power. So are we not going to suffer long term for the kind of politics we're practicing, monarchy style but democratically?
That's the point I have. That's the point I have been making. Your statement was very ironic. A hybrid.
A hybrid of a monarchy and a democracy.
Monarchism and democracy. Oh yeah. The point I'm making is we must appreciate that we are living in very challenging times in Uganda. And the best way is to have an honest discussion. An honest discussion that Kenya had, which made it a better place. So if you have an honest discussion, it will redo or undo all the contradictions. Once the contradictions are done, you're going to have a professional army, you're going to have a professional civil service, you're going to have competent CEOs of government parastatals, you're going to have a functioning parliament, which is not a rubber stamp. So,
a very free media.
Absolutely. Once you have all those, it doesn't matter whether it's a son of Kazibwe or not who is going to succeed here. But the moment you do not reorganize that, you're going to have challenges like the challenges you see in Burkina Faso, in Chad, and elsewhere.
Well, that's very interesting, and of course it's something that we should be pondering on going forward. It's been a pleasure hearing the insights and perspective from Dr. Ssemogerere on the issues of the day. I have categorically chosen to leave out the Ukraine-Russia war.
We'll pick it up
because
on another
we shall
day.
pick it up on another day. Yeah. Why? Because it has a way, the tentacles kind of spread into the economics and the geopolitical spaces that, again, we do not want to open. It could be a Pandora's box for us here on Morning at NTV. Dr. Ssemogerere, many thanks for making time for the show. Well, that will do it for the Kickstarter discussion. It's been a pleasure.